Angelicus Questions you. Spurb.
Welcome to episode 60 of Spurbs Herbs. Today we're going to be talking about an interesting herb, Eremophila longifolia, also known as berrigan. So it's Eremophila longifolia. And trust me, I did practice this. It's just tough sometimes with the Latin. All right, without further ado, let's talk about what we're going to do today. Today's episode is looking at another herb of the world. In this case, another Australian herb, Eremophila longifolia, commonly known as berrigan. I have no clue what this herb is used for, but I am super excited to find out and add some more knowledge. And as usual, we will be exploring something a little different. We will discuss the pharmacological concept of bioavailability and discuss its marketing aspects as well. Please join us as we find out about an interesting Australian herb. It's going to be another interesting and, dare I say, exciting episode. Before we get into that, I want to tell you about something. I am starting a new webinar series. I just started. I had the first episode last week, and I wanted to let my podcast listeners know about it before anyone else. It is Integrative Nutrition in Chinese Medicine, and will cover biomedical and Chinese concepts of nutrition and explore the complementary and alternative concepts that are part of the modern supplement industry. This series will be one live class per month, covering a category of nutrition, and will include some basic biochemistry, nutrition, and supplements available on the market. In other words, it's going to be the perfect combination of biochemical nutrition, supplements, Chinese medicine, and real-world use cases. Why would you use this stuff? If you are a practitioner of any stripe or just interested in nutrition, this is the series for you. And you can sign up for the first class or the whole series at www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org. That's Integrative Medicine Council, COUNCIL.org. I will only be teaching each class live one time. After that, it will only be available as a recording. So don't miss this opportunity to learn about a topic all our patients ask about and get a firm understanding of the basics of integrative nutrition. And that brings us to our little something different today, which is going to be bioavailability. And this is an interesting topic. It may not sound like it, but it can be. It's important in pharmacology, but is often distorted when it comes to marketing of supplements. Let's talk about the science and definitions behind bioavailability, and then discuss how it can be misused by shady marketers to separate their customers from their money. Technically, bioavailability is what fraction of the dose of a drug or supplement reaches its site of action or a body fluid where it has access to its site of action. So generally what this means is the blood. By definition, the bioavailability of an intravenous injection, so if you inject something directly into the vein, it is 100%. So because blood is considered to be one of those body fluids where it has access to its site of action. So once it gets into the blood, that's considered to be bioavailable. And so if you're injecting something directly into the blood, 100% bioavailable. The difference comes in when we do an oral, when we ingest it. So oral drug or supplement blood concentrations will always be less than an intravenous administration. In other words, it will be less than 100%. So when you eat something or swallow a supplement or even put it, the sublinguals under your tongue, it's always going to be, not all of it is going to get to the blood. And so it's always going to be less than 100%. And we're not even going to talk about sublinguals today. That's a great topic for us to talk about in the future. But that has aspects, that can certainly be affected by bioavailability as well. Now, in general, it's hard to say sometimes. Bioavailability can be plotted on a graph. And we have a graph here for those listening. It's just a curve with a steep hill, and then it goes down. There's nothing special to it, but there are several relevant variables in talking about bioavailability. The first one is something called Cmax, which is the maximum plasma concentration of a drug or supplement. So you take something in, where is that going to get its maximum? And of course, that depends on the dose. It also can depend on the timing of the dose and the half-life of the dose. So we're going to get into all those in just a second. Well, at least some of those. So that's Cmax. There's also a minimum or trough concentration, or Cmin, and that doesn't really play a huge role. Again, dosing can play a role, half-life can play a role, but also what's really important is repeated dosing, is like how often are you taking it. So Cmin, it's important, but whatever. We have the half-life. This is interesting. It's the time needed to decrease the plasma concentration of a drug by half. And that's not really relevant to bioavailability directly, except for Tmax. Half-life is not just the time to decrease the plasma concentration by a drug. It's also the time it takes for, it's often related to the time it takes for a drug to enter the blood. And so there's other aspects to that as well, but so it can be related to it, but not directly, but it's an important pharmacological concept. What is very important to bioavailability, we talked about this curve, and the area below these curves, so it's you have this curve, and then everything under it is shaded in the picture that we have, but just think of that as a shaded curve. This is called, it's a pharmacological concept, and it's actually called area under the curve. Now that may sound really strange, but actually, if you're familiar with calculus at all, and we're not going to talk too much about math, but calculus is integration, an integration of a formula is this area under the curve, basically. And so this is an integration, a calculus derived variable. And it's called, it's area under the curve, and it's shortened AUC. So AUC is a measurement of total drug exposure over time. Now, again, that may not sound like bioavailability. Bioavailability is like how much of it gets into your system, but technically the definition of bioavailability is there's a formula, and it's a mathematical formula, and it's basically bioavailability of an oral drug is the AUC oral, so how much drug exposure is there from an oral dose, divided by AUC injected, or how much drug exposure there would be if it were actually injected, which, remember, is always 100%, and you times it by 100, so to get a percentage. And that's the technical definition of bioavailability. I don't think we need to worry about the technicality so much in this, other than to know that it's a measurement of how much of a given substance can actually enter the body, especially when it's done orally, when you're ingesting it. And there are several factors that can affect bioavailability. First one is an interesting one, and it's called first pass hepatic metabolism. And what that refers to is drugs and supplements entering the hepatic portal system from the intestine. So this is getting a little technical, but with the anatomy of the intestines, what happens is when we ingest something from our intestines, it normally, so a portal system, so normally we have blood comes from the heart, goes into the arteries, which goes into arterioles, capillaries, into venules, into veins, and back to the heart. So that's a loop around the body. A portal system is interesting because instead of going arteries, capillaries, we're going to skip the arterioles and venules right now. Instead of going arteries, capillaries, veins, heart, it goes arteries, capillaries, vein, heart. In other words, there's a second capillary bed in there. And they're fairly rare in the body. The hepatic portal system is one of those. The other one that we're not going to get into, but there's one involving the pituitary gland. We're not going to talk about that today, but the hepatic portal system is very interesting and very important in the body. Basically what happens is, so you have arteries going to the intestines, and then the intestines are absorbing nutrients from the food we eat. And instead of going straight to the heart, they actually go to the liver first. That's the hepatic. Hepatic refers to the liver, hepatic portal system. And what that allows the liver to do is to clean. One of the jobs of the liver is to clean. So if anything got in that's not that's harmful to us. It can be immediately cleaned. And it also packages up nutrients. We don't want things like free fats just floating around in our blood. So it packages it into lipoproteins, which are cholesterol and things along those lines. So that's just an example. There's other packaging that happens as well. So the liver is very important from that. So it's very strategically placed, this hepatic portal system. But what it does is when it hits the liver starts the process of elimination. And so some of it can actually be metabolized, made into other things, and those other things can be eliminated. And that's what's referred to as first pass hepatic metabolism. So that's one factor that can do this. So right away, it's not entering the main bloodstream. It's just being somehow shifted away from the liver. So that affects bioavailability. And right there is a major reason why we don't have 100% availability from things that are ingested. Other aspects that can affect bioavailability include drug solubility or supplement solubility, very hydrophilic, really loving water, or hydrophobic drugs. They don't like water, or they like fat. So think of oil and water. Oil and water doesn't like to mix. So if you try to mix them, they separate. Same thing here, and that drug solubility can play a role. If they are very hydrophilic, really water-loving, or really fat-loving, lipophilic, they have difficulty crossing cell membranes and entering the circulation. So if it's that, it stays in the intestine and gets excreted. Another factor is chemical instability. Some drugs may be affected by the pH in the stomach or the acidity of the stomach, or various degradative enzymes in the gastrointestinal tract. In other words, it can be broken down in the intestines, which is what the intestines are designed to do in the stomach and all that. So it makes sense. And then finally, sure there's other factors, but these are the big ones. Chemical physical properties of the drug or supplement formulation. So chemical physical means chemistry and physics. So just basically, and not just physics, but physical makeup. So the chemistry and physical makeup. So many factors can play a role in bioavailability, such as particle size. Generally, the smaller it is, the easier it is going to be to absorb. Salt forms can play a role in this. And this is where a lot of supplements we'll see is like, often supplements are combined with hydrogen chloride, and which you should, if you remember back to your basic chemistry, is an acid. But it's also, in this case, a salt that can form with a supplement. Very basic sort of thing. Or you might hear like calcium carbonate. Might be calcium is a great thing. You get calcium carbonate, calcium lactate, calcium. There's a bunch of others. Those are all different salt forms, and those can affect the bioavailability. Excipients can affect bioavailability as well. The excipients are technically inert substances that are added into pills. They can be used to bulkify the pill so that it's big enough for us to swallow easily. But it can be used to stabilize the pill so it doesn't get a lot of water from the environment or it doesn't evaporate. But also it can actually slow down the absorption or prevent the absorption of some parts. So excipients, they're inert to the body. In other words, they don't really affect us, but they can affect how the supplement is absorbed. So that's it. And among others, there's other aspects of chemical physical properties of the formulation that can affect this. So these are all factors in bioavailability. Drugs and supplements can enter cells, which they need to do in order to enter the blood through three main mechanisms. We're going to talk about these briefly. The first is passive diffusion. And this basically means the makeup of the drug helps determine how easy or difficult the drug will traverse cell membranes. We already kind of talked about some of the chemical physical properties that would play a role in this. This is determined by the concentration gradient, how lipophilic the drug is, and the surface area of the cell. So in other words, if there's a lot of something outside the cell and very little on the inside, that's the concentration gradient, and it wants to, we call it riding the gradient. So they want to come into the cell because there's less concentration, wants to even out that concentration. So that's one thing that can do this. Lipophilia, the cell membranes are very lipophilic. They like fat. So generally substances that are fairly, remember we said we don't want it very lipophilic, but if it's sort of lipophilic or mostly lipophilic, the cell membrane is like that, and it's easier for it to pass through. And the more area of the cell, the more easily it's going to pass through. And this is great because if you look at the intestines, we have something called microvilli, which are just a lot of grooves and just massively increase the cell area of the surface of the cell. So it makes sense that this would work very well. Sorry, the surface area of the cell. So it makes sense that that would work very well, especially there. So that's one mechanism for getting into the cells, and it needs to enter the cells before it can enter the blood. Remember, the way it works is you have the intestines, you have a cell, and then through that cell it can enter the blood. So it has to enter the cell in order to be bioavailable. So the second way it can do that is facilitated diffusion, which is where there's a carrier protein in the cell membrane which facilitates the drugs or supplements movement into the interior of that cell. It does not require energy in order to produce this effect, and that's a key aspect of this. It's facilitated. There's a protein that allows it to do it, but that protein doesn't require any energy. And the third method does require energy. It's called active transport. It's similar to that facilitated diffusion, and in that it does have a protein that aids the drug's ability to enter the cell, but it takes energy, usually in the form of adenosine triphosphate, ATP, which is the energy molecule in the human body. It's the most prominent one. There's others, but that is by far the most common one in the body. So those are three ways it can enter the cell. Another aspect of bioavailability is that most drugs and supplements are either a weak acid or a weak base. Again, we said we didn't want anything strongly hydrophilic or strongly lipophilic. Weak acids and weak bases are generally on the hydrophilic side, but weak, not much. Whether a drug is charged or neutral can affect how readily it crosses the cell membrane. Uncharged chemicals can more easily traverse membranes. Basically, lipophilic, when you have a lot of fats, they don't like charges. Charges really like water. Weak acids and bases can be charged or uncharged based on physiological pH. In other words, what's the normal pH, which is about 7.4 pH. Each drug has a different net charge or non-charge at the body's pH, and therefore a different inherent ability to cross cell membranes. And so this would be part of that passive diffusion especially, but it can also affect facilitated diffusion and active transport as well. So I have a question. Why are we discussing bioavailability in the context of herbs and supplements? And the answer for me is because companies will market their supplements by saying their product is better than their competitors. And very, very often they will say it is better because their product is more bioavailable than their competitors. First of all, just the claim of increased bioavailability is difficult to prove. This is because individuals vary dramatically in how they absorb nutrients depending on such factors as age, underlying conditions. If you have GI tract stuff, you have Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, diarrhea, constipation, it'll affect this. And just natural variability, just genetic natural variability between individuals. Often studies by companies to determine bioavailability are small, poorly constructed, or even in animals, so they have no bearing on humans at all, none of which give definitive answers as to which is more or less bioavailable. But the bigger issue of companies using this as a marketing point is economics. Just because your supplement is twice as bioavailable, that does not justify a price that is 4 or 5 times higher. If this is the case, I can just take 2 of the lower bioavailable supplement, get the same exact amount in my system, and instead of paying 4 or 5 times as much, I'm only paying twice as much. Same amount absorbed at less than half the cost. And I'm making this up as a scenario, but I've seen this. I have gone to conventions, and there's someone there trying to sell supplements, and they're kind of sometimes loudly with a flyer in my face, sometimes whispering. It's like, we're better than those guys just a few exhibits down because ours are more bioavailable. It's like, well, okay, but yours are 5 times more expensive. So if you're double the bioavailability, but I'm spending 5 times as much, why don't I just take 2 of the cheaper stuff and I'm good to go, and I've saved a lot of money. A lot of money. These things aren't cheap. I mean, when we're saying 5 times the value, I mean, we're talking the difference between a $10 or $15 bottle and a $75 bottle of something. It's ridiculous, the pricing on this stuff, especially when they start bringing in this as a justification for it, because there's no justification for it. It's almost everything I've seen, I haven't done all the calculators all the time, but more often than not, that I've done quick calculations, I'll save money just taking more of the lesser one if I want to get the same amount as your more bioavailable type. And here's the third issue with this that's a real concern for me, and that is toxicity. Recommended daily intakes, which in the United States are released every 5 years, describe how much of a nutrient we should be getting on a daily basis in order to avoid deficiency and its inherent effects. We don't want a deficiency syndrome that puts us into a sick state, basically. And these are based on quote unquote normal or common bioavailability of these nutrients. If you suddenly start supplementing with a variation of the nutrient that dramatically increases bioavailability, it is possible to cause toxic levels of the nutrient in the system. So an example of this is calcium. The recommended daily intake for calcium is 1,000 milligrams in adult men and women, which increases to 1,200 milligrams in women over 50. And signs and symptoms of toxicity have been shown at about 1,800 milligrams of intake. That's not a lot of room there. The bioavailability of calcium varies based on the source, but supplements can range from less than 28% to maybe 36% bioavailable normally. So in other words, to get 1,000 milligrams, if you were to take 1,000 milligrams of calcium, then you're only going to get about anywhere from 280 to 360 milligrams of actual calcium, which is fine. That's in the calculation of RDI. So what this means is if one were to take a supplement with much higher bioavailability, it might be pretty easy to get into the toxic range. So for example, just for round numbers, let's say someone is taking 600 milligrams of calcium supplement and is absorbing about 30% of that, or 180 milligrams of calcium. If the bioavailability shot up to 50% from 30%, that means they're getting 300 milligrams of calcium, or don't worry about the math, it's there, or the equivalent of 1,000 milligram supplement instead of a 600 milligram supplement. Add in dietary sources or taking an extra pill, and you are very likely to get into toxic ranges. If you take 2 of those pills, you are toxic. You are in the toxic range. That's an issue. So it's not just, because there's extra bioavailability, it's all good. No, extra bioavailability puts you at greater risk potentially of toxic effects. So understanding bioavailability is really important, especially when we may be recommending herbs or supplements to patients, family, and or friends. Let's not buy into the bogus marketing claims of supplement companies surrounding bioavailability, so we can protect our community and prevent them from spending excess funds on untrue and potentially harmful claims. And with that introduction to bioavailability, and without further ado, let's get into today's herb. And today we are going to be talking about Eremophila longifolia, longifolia. I'm not sure if that's a hard G or a soft G. The family for this herb is Scrophulariaceae, or figwort family. The species specifically is Eremophila longifolia RBR, parentheses, F mule. So if you remember, we talked a little bit about this in the past. Those are referring to the people who put it in their genetic places in the species and everything. And the one in parentheses is sort of the first one to do it, but then it was revised and is by the one that's not in parentheses. So we have RBR. I don't know who that's specifically referring to. You can look it up. And F mule would be the current, the more modern biologist or botanist who put it in its classification. The medicinal part basically seems to be leaves. We're going to talk about other parts, but not really in a medicinal way. Other names for this herb are emu apple, dogwood, juniper tree, long-leaved Eremophila, berrigan emu bush, fuchsia bush, and native plum tree. Berrigan, unfortunately, is also used as a name for Pittosporum filiorodis, or native apricot, and Eremophila alternifolia, so a different species under this genus of Eremophila, also known as the narrow-leaved fuchsia bush. And that's sort of common in this. And then I have a bunch of Aboriginal names. I do not know how to pronounce the. So one of the things I kind of wanted to get into, but I didn't. I decided not to. But I wanted to talk about because it's important here. This is an Aboriginal, Australian Aboriginal herb, and we're going to see other uses, important uses in that. But we like to think of Australian Aboriginals as sort of a monolithic sort of culture, and they are anything but. They're made up of hundreds, if not thousands, of very specific tribes, all with their own languages. So thousands of different languages, different rituals and culture, and all these sort of things. It's, we coming from the United States, I mean, we can think of the Native Americans where we have a bunch of different, nations, Indian nations, which are very different from each other. So, the Apaches versus the, Iroquois and stuff along those lines. So very similar, but even more. Remember, Australia is as large as mainland America, so it's a large thing, a large continent, a large nation, and very different sort of things. So a lot of different names, different languages. Each language has its own way of pronunciation, so I have no way to pronounce it, but I'm going to try, and then I'm going to spell it. So Amuna is one of the Aboriginal names, Amuna. Tulipurpa, or Tulypurpa. Otenange, Anje, Otn, Otenerrenge, or Orthorenge, Ortherrenge, Tulipur, Tullypur, Julpur, Julpur, and Ngawal, Ngawil. So sorry if your ears hurt from that. But there you go. So those are all Aboriginal names. And there's plenty more, I'm sure. A lot of my sources were central and northern. So there wasn't a lot of southern sources that I found in about this herb. Though I think it still grows in the south. I think it's important in southern regions, but there just wasn't literature that I could find on it. So that opens up a whole bunch of other names as well for this. So the Scrophulariaceae family is a diverse family known as the figwort or snapdragon family. And when you see the picture of this, it kind of reminds you of snapdragon, so it makes sense. There are 220 genera and 3,000 species in this family. These plants generally have symmetrical two-lipped tubular form of the flowers, often borne on long spires. Foxglove or digitalis, a plant in this family, is an important medicinal herb, which is the source of the cardiac glycosides used for treating arrhythmias, and it also includes many ornamental garden plants. All right, so let's talk about this. The genus Eremophila, tribe Myoporiae. So tribe is an interesting one. It's part of classification, and it's basically, think of it as a subgenera, and often it's called a subgenus, and sometimes it's called a tribe, or family is another name I've seen, and I'm not sure there's differences between those three, but I've often seen it. So that would be Myoporiae, and so the Eremophila is one of the largest genera of Scrophulariaceae. I just said it just fine. Scrophulariaceae. There you go. I'm not going to try it again. Consisting of more than 260 species, all of which are endemic to Australia. So all of these species of Eremophila, this genus, is Australian. The genus is widespread in arid areas of mainland Australia, but none occur naturally in Tasmania, particularly in Western Australia, South Australia, and the Northern Territory. Whilst individual species can range in size from prostrate shrubs, for e.g. Eremophila serpens or chinook, to small trees, Eremophila bignoniflora. Most species grow as compact, low-growing shrubs. The size and shape of Eremophila species is also variable, although the leaves are generally relatively small and may be shiny or hairy. The flowers also share common features across the genus, generally having 5 petals per flower, which are joined at their base, forming a tube. The flower color can vary widely between species, with red, purple, lilac, mauve, cream, white, or even green-colored flowers being common across many species. Notably, many Eremophila species share common names, which include emu bush or poverty bush, which relate to the belief that the emus eat the fruit of these species and to the arid, poor environment in which they grow. The first Australians had substantial knowledge of Eremophila species and utilized multiple species medicinally. Indeed, an earlier study noted that of approximately 70 species that had been identified as being used therapeutically by first Australians from Central Australia, approximately a third of those species belong to either the Eremophila or Acacia genera. As well as their medicinal uses, Eremophila species have a wide variety of other uses by the first Australians, including their use in cleansing ceremonies, in initiation rites, and in lining graves. We'll talk a little bit about this as well. This was a really good article by Cock, C-O-C-K. That's the gentleman's, I think his gentleman's last name, and their team. And that was written in 2022, so last year, as I'm reading this. The history, let's talk about history. The history of specific herbs and medicinals used by the first Australians is very difficult to determine. They have not had a written language, and knowledge and traditions have been passed down orally. With hundreds, if not thousands, of different nations and languages, it is difficult to know the origins or ancient uses of Aboriginal medicinals. What we can do to fill in some of the potential history is discuss some of the non-medicinal uses of this plant, as it is if not one of the most important plants, especially to the Central Aboriginal nations. And you know, just as we're doing here, just a little brief history about the Aboriginals, nothing major. A lot of the articles that I read refer to 50,000 years of Aborigines in Australia. When I was in Australia and lived there, I always heard 40,000 years, which 10,000 years seems like a big difference. So I usually go with 40,000 years of continuous culture, and that makes it one of the largest long-term cultures in the world, longest existing cultures in the world. They say they are the longest. I'm not an expert in that, so I don't know. But certainly, if not the longest living culture, it's amongst the living cultures of that. So that means this history is very long, and a lot of it is lost to oral tradition. So what are some of these non-medicinal uses of Eremophila longifolia? This plant, I'm quoting here, again, I'm quoting from another book by Latz, and this is called Bushfires and Bush Tucker Aboriginal Plant Use in Central Australia. So this is this plant has considerable ritual significance for most Central Australian peoples. Although there does not appear to be a suitable English term to describe it, it could be said to be the most sacred, mystical, or magical of all Central Australian plants. They said this in parentheses, which I find a little bit odd. The leaves and branch are used extensively in ceremonies, especially during elaborate circumcision rites. Small sprigs are placed in the headbands and armbands of the novices at certain stages, and the foliage is heated to produce an acrid smoke for particular rites. And again in parentheses, the novice look forward to being smoked, as this signifies the end of a particularly grueling stage of the ceremony. Smoke from the leaves is used ritually to blacken certain artifacts. Leaves are also used to brush sacred objects and the bodies of men at certain stages in ritual ceremonies. The branches of this shrub are used to line graves and to cover bodies. This practice being carried out in other parts of Australia as well. If circumstances require that non-initiated persons obtain water from sacred water holes, a procedure which includes branches of this shrub is carried out. In the past, twigs from Eremophila, probably this species, have been placed in headbands, armbands, and through the nasal septum of returning Arente war parties to signify success in killing one or more of the enemy. A caterpillar with exquisite markings that feeds on the leaves of this plants are a totemic animal of Orandic peoples. Branches of this shrub are often used to surround emu flesh in the cooking process. And finally, grubs at the roots of this plant are edible and used as food. So grubs are an important food source in bush tucker is what they would say, bush food for the Aborigine people. And if you're not familiar with the grub, it's basically the caterpillar form of, and they can be quite large too. So we had when I was living in Australia, we had a little introduction to bush tucker where there was just a handful of us that went out with some Aborigines women, and we found just food laying around, like they call them bush tomatoes, or they're like little berries. They taste like tomatoes. They're really nice. And then we found a grub, and one of my colleagues had the privilege of actually eating it. So they said it tastes like, not my friend, but other people have described it, says it tastes like a mixture of peanut butter and egg yolks, and is a particular delicacy apparently. So there you go. So that's some of the non-medicinal uses of this plant. Let's talk about some of the traditional uses of this plant. So a decoction from the crushed leaves has widespread use as an eye wash, a cure for skin ailments and headaches, or as a general body wash for various ailments. Treatment is said to induce restful and restorative sleep. Again, this is from that book by Latz, which is Bushfires and Bush Tucker. Isaacs says something similar. Fresh plants broken up and soaked in water. The liquid is used as a medicinal bath for general sickness and colds, and decoction applied to sores. So this doesn't have a lot of connective words because it was in a table. This one's called, this book was by Isaacs, is called Bush Food, Aboriginal Food and Herbal Medicine. So it wasn't very in-depth, but it had some really beautiful pictures in it. So that's where that's from. Another book, which is a good hefty book and a little bit more scientific than some of these others, called Traditional Aboriginal Medicines in the Northern Territory of Australia, adds the wash can be applied once a day for scabies, sores, bites, and stings, to localize boils and to relieve aching muscles and joints. It is also applied for headache and chest pains associated with severe colds and flus. The leaves may be mashed together with a little water and rubbed directly onto scabies. When treated this way, leaves are also used as a dressing to encourage the discharge of pus from boils and carbuncles. Crushed dried leaves are mixed with animal fat to make a thin ointment, which is massaged into tender, swollen joints or applied over scabies. If you're not familiar with scabies, they're little mites that actually burrow under the skin and lay eggs. It's very difficult to get rid of, and it's more disconcerting than painful. I think it's a little irritating, but it's not huge for the host, but it is a really weird thing to see, anyways, difficult to deal with. Continuing with traditional uses, several sources also discuss the use of this plant for women's health. Erandic peoples use, Erandic people is just one of those nations or tribes of Aborigines. Erandic peoples use the acrid smoke fumes from smoldering leaves to smoke mothers and their newborn babies. Not only is this considered to strengthen the babies and stop the mother's bleeding, but it also increases or initiates a mother's milk supply. That's according to Latz again. In the center, branches of the common plains plant Eremophila longifolia are placed over a fire to make a cleansing steam medicine used after childbirth. Similarly, to bring on breast milk, the woman lies down on her stomach with breasts suspended over the steam-filled pit. Again, this was Isaac's, so these are two different books. So those are the traditional uses for this. So we see a lot of interesting uses here. So let's talk about dosage and preparation. Unfortunately, dosing of this herb is difficult to determine, as most sources generally describe its use without giving specific amounts to be used. Often you'll hear a handful or some or something along those lines. Traditionally, since there was no vessels to carry or boil water, many medicinals were prepared as a cold water decoction by soaking in wood bowls. So remember, the Aborigines are generally migratory in general. And so, carrying big clay pots or something like that was just not something that was developed in their culture. But they did have wooden bowls, and so they would soak it overnight or something along those lines and create a cold water decoction. And as we already discussed, smoking was also a common form of application and use. Ointment as well, on occasion. Chinese medical actions. So this is interesting. I searched through several texts, and an internet search did not yield any descriptions of this herb as a Chinese medicinal. Given its use as an internal herb to treat colds and flus, in addition to it containing several essential oils, it seems like this herb would have clear heat toxin properties and belong in that category of herbs according to Chinese medicine. This is me supposing, just putting on some of my own spin on this, so feel free to disagree with me. I have no problem with that. This is also supported by its topical use in infections. Since it can help sore muscles and joints, we could add that it is that as a topical and may also move or regulate the qi and or blood. While it is used for various aspects of childbirth, the application of smoking, which is rarely used in Chinese medicine, it is one of the applications in Chinese medicine, but rarely used, makes it hard to translate into a Chinese action, though it may help support the yin or jing or essence in this context. Especially it says strengthens mothers and babies. So that really kind of implies an essence tonification. The yin nourishing aspect is possibly supported by its use to aid sleep. So that is where that can come into play. Given several of its uses, I would suggest this herb is cooling and may enter the lungs, liver, and kidney. Again, just me trying to do my best to translate it into Chinese medicine, so take it with a grain of salt. Contents of this herb. There appears to be several essential oils in Eremophila longifolia, especially alpha and beta pinene and limonene. These are considered these are considered monoterpenoids, and these and borneol and methone, a powerful antibacterial, are mentioned by that the paper by Koch and his team or her team. Terpinolene, alpha terpineol, and saponine also have antibacterial activity and have been found as contents of this herb. The leaves appear to have several macro minerals, especially potassium, calcium, and magnesium, and smaller quantities of sodium and iron. And there appear to be significant levels of tannic acid. The different samples they had on this was about 1 to 4% tannic acids. So that I think is fairly significant. Koch and his team also says the following are significant contents with medicinal properties. They had furanoid sesquiterpenoids, and in here there were genofuranol, a major component of the smoke extract, which was detected only when the herb was burned. So that's really interesting because it wasn't there when it wasn't burned. So therefore, and yet we know it is. It says here, and it may help with Alzheimer's disease and diabetes mellitus. So right there, this idea of, maybe your first reaction, my first reaction was smoking. What does that do? But here it is. It's a compound that doesn't exist unless you smoke it. You use the smoke, you burn it. And then there's this compound that can be very helpful. So really interesting. It also may contain iridoid glycosides. And in these, there's genopositic acid and verbascoside, which may have significant cardioactive effects, in other words, help the heart, and may reduce platelet aggregation. Those are pretty significant effects. Always take it a grain of salt. I mean, the contents are important because it helps explain why herbs are doing it. but we can do too much significance to something that is in very small quantities on this, and while it may have these effects in more concentrated forms, but also in this context, it may work with a lot of the other things to have beneficial effects also. So, I think the contents are important, but I also think we don't want to put too much emphasis on them. So what does the science say about all this? So this genus, the whole genus, not just this species, has strong antibacterial properties, especially through its essential oils and other constituents, as we've already discussed. This was supported by Sadgrove and their team, which they have antioxidant properties as well. Essential oils also specifically showed antifungal activity against several species of fungi, including Candida albicans. While not specific to Eremophila longifolia, several species of the genus show anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory effects, which correlate with several of its traditional uses, especially those achy muscles things. So it makes sense that it would have some anti-inflammatory effects. Immunomodulatory means it helps the immune system, which, when you're thinking about the childbirth aspects of it, that can be very helpful as well. Drug-herb interactions on this. So a search for drug-herb interactions with Eremophila longifolia yielded no results. I did it in general, interactions. I did it specifically for cytochrome interactions and glycoprotein interactions, and nothing came up. Given its relatively specific use by Australian Aboriginal peoples, it is not surprising there are no interaction studies. This is not a very widely used herb outside of the Aboriginal people. Similarly, the American Herbal Products Association's Botanical Safety Handbook does not have an entry for this herb. So, and neither, I don't mention it, but I also looked it up in the PDR for herbal medicines, which is a pretty large tome. Didn't have anything, and I didn't expect them to. They generally tend to be a little bit more towards Western herbs, but I didn't see anything. There was a lot on the web, and some of decent caliber, because it is such an important herb for the Australia Aboriginals. But not, in the books, a lot of the books I have on this, and I haven't seen a whole bunch of updates, are a little bit older. So there's just not a ton of information on this, and nothing on drug-herb interactions. I could find nothing. The one book, Traditional Aboriginal Medicines in the Northern Territory of Australia, says the wash should not be taken internally, and care should be taken to avoid splashing the liquid in the eyes. So that's interesting, because one of its uses is in ophthalmology. They can put it in the eye, the wash in the eye. And the other thing is basically the wash, which is crushed leaves soaked in water, is also said to be taken internally for flus and colds. So I think these concerns are interesting, because they fly right in the face of what other books said is its appropriate use. So, but I did want to put them in here and at least mention them as we're talking about them. But those were the only concerns I could really find. Again, a lot of these books are more explaining what they're used for. A lot of these books seem to me to be a little bit early in the investigations of these things, and so I'm not surprised we couldn't find much of anything as far as concerns, because they're a little bit more, hey, these are traditional peoples and they have really useful medicines. We should learn more from them, as opposed to, well, this is what it's used and this is why we need to be cautious about it, which is sort of Chinese medicine, if you look at those books. So it's a little bit of a different approach. It's that's why I say it's early. Like early is like we need to boost it a little bit to get some interest in it, and then we can investigate it more seriously. So I feel like that's where we're at. And that's basically where we're at. So in summary, we started our discussion today with an introduction to bioavailability, an important pharmacological concept with very relevant implications for herbs and supplements. From there, we did our deep dive into Eremophila longifolia, a very interesting and important Australian Aboriginal herb with interesting benefits and cultural significance. And I looked it up you can purchase this and use it. So I was happy to see this. Sometimes with the Aboriginal herbs especially, they're hard to find and hard to get your hands on to use them as an herb. But I did find sites that you can actually purchase this herb. One of the sites that I looked at, it looked really nice actually, was in a tea. They had it all crushed up and dried, and you can drink it as a tea, which again would do a lot of the benefits of some of the traditional uses that we discussed. So you can do it, you can use it. I'm interested in some of these things to see if this would work on some of these things, but it's definitely doable. Overall, a very interesting herb with some genuine helpfulness, hopefully. And surprisingly, because last time I did an Australian herb, there was not much in the way of scientific evidence or research or papers on it even. This had a good amount of scientific papers available. Not, a lot more research needs to happen, but I think that is significant in that this is such an important herb for the Aboriginal peoples. And so there was a lot more on it than I was expecting, honestly. Okay, well, that was Eremophila longifolia. In our next episode, we will be exploring a very useful herb, fong fong, or siler root. This is a relatively commonly used herb in Chinese medicine for treating colds and arthritis. These don't seem related, but in Chinese medicine they can be, which we will be investigating. And as usual, we will be exploring something a little different. Please join us, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on even one exciting episode. Thank you very much. Appreciate you listening. If you like this podcast, please do us a favor. Give us a 5-star rating in your favorite podcast app. We thank you in advance. We'd really appreciate it. And remember, you can get continuing education units and National Certification Commission of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine professional development activities at www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org. That's Integrative Medicine Council, COUNCIL.org. And you can always get in touch with me at Dr. Greg at spurbsherbs.com. That's SPERBSHERBS.com. As when I teach this in Australia, they would always, whenever I'd say herb, they'd say, excuse me, do you mean herb? So then I go, no, I meant herb. So we have the silent H here. So Spurbs Herbs, or at our website, www.spurbsherbs.com. And as usual, we have our bibliography. Thank you.
Spurbs Herbs. The proceeding was presented by Dr. Greg Sperber. We would like to thank Janelle for all her support and everybody else who contributed to this program.
Janelle.
Timothy Dobbins,
Rogers,
Campbell.